Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 66, The Midwives of the Lady Penryn. 18 births took place during the First Fleet voyage to Port Jackson, including 2 stillbirths and 1 miscarriage. Phoebe Norton and Anne Colpitts were 2 convict women who assisted births on the journey, on their ship, the Lady Penryn. This is their story. Phoebe Norton. Phoebe was born in 1756 in Kent, England. On the 25th of October 1776, she was convicted of stealing household goods at the Old Bailey in London and was sentenced to be transported for 7 years. Her occupation at the time was a charwoman, or in other words, a cleaner. The transcript from the Old Bailey, case number 831, Phoebe Norton was indicted for feloniously stealing on the 20th day of August 1776 a tablespoon, value 5 shillings, 3 teaspoons to the value of 3 shillings, a counterpane, value 4 shillings, 3 sheets, valued 6 shillings, a coat to the value of 4 shillings, a satin waistcoat valued at 4 shillings, a tablecloth, value 1 shilling, 2 check curtains, value 1 shilling and 6 pence, 1 pair of leather gloves, value of 6 pence, all the property of James Milne. Edward Swain sworn, I am a servant to Thomas Page, a pawnbroker, at number 32 St Martin's Lane. I perfectly remember the prisoner coming to our house. I have frequently seen her at our house pledging things. It was in August last. She pledged a coat, a counterpane and a variety of other articles. They are in my possession and she said they were her own. She pledged them in the name of Mary Jones and she told me that she lived at Bedfordbury. James Milne sworn, I know the prisoner perfectly. She was my servant. She was 9 weeks my engaged servant, but prior to that was 2 months an assistant as charwoman. She was then in the name of Knight, but upon the examination before the magistrate she said her name was Phoebe Norton. I am a single man and the prisoner did not only assist as a servant but a housekeeper. I am out 6 hours in the day and while I am out the servants may turn the house inside out. The prisoner ran away the 21st of August. After she was gone, I missed the property from different parts of the house. I found these things again in the possession of Thomas Page. They are such things as I lost. When you saw the prisoner, did you charge her with taking these things? He said yes. The prisoner, my lord, my master has never paid me any wages. If my master ever paid me wages, I meant to have redeemed them. He owed me being a servant for nearly 10 weeks and for being a charwoman for nearly 2 months. The prosecutor, her predecessor was indisposed and she wanted an assistant to go through the minutiae of the house. She sent me a bill from Newgate for 10 weeks' wages, but she had 2 pairs of slippers from a shoemaker's and asked me for 5 shillings, which I gave her to buy some things. The prisoner, I owed the prosecutor 12 shillings. The jury, did the goods all come at once or 2 or 3 times pawning? They did not come at once, they were pawned at different times from June to August. She was found guilty of theft and grand larceny, transported for 7 years by Mr. Justice Heath. She left England as a 31-year-old on the Lady Penryn. There was an incident involving Phoebe while at anchorage at Cape Town. Phoebe Norton, a convict on board, fell from the head, the toilet seat at the bow of the ship, into the sea. It was a remarkable calm day, therefore, before she had time to go down, 2 men jumped overboard and saved her by hauling her into the pinnace, which was fastened at the stern. And that was reported by Surgeon Arthur Bowes-Smith. Lady Penryn was known as the worst sailing ship in the fleet. Upon her arrival in Port Jackson, Phoebe met William Parrish. Wednesday the 13th of February 1788 was an auspicious day. Governor Phillip took the oath of abjuration before Judge Advocate David Collins, as well as the oath of assurance. And on this same day, Phoebe married William Parrish, a fellow convict, alongside 6 other couples. William signed the marriage certificate as William Potter, one of his chosen aliases. Phoebe signed with a cross, her name being written by the clerk, Samuel Barnes. After Phoebe helped successfully deliver babies on the Lady Penryn, she went on to attend hundreds of births and became one of the colony's busiest midwives. a little on her husband, William Parrish. William was born in 1750. However, this is based on information given on his death certificate, so cannot be fully verified with birth records. However, his convict record says he was born about 1764 and was 24 when he was convicted at Middlesex for a term of 7 years. And as mentioned, he went also by the name of William Potter. In his case, William Stent, the prosecutor, was sworn and said, "I am a shoemaker living at Pimlico. On the 27th of September, I was going up to Five Fields, Chelsea. I met the prisoner about midway on the road. It was a by-road. He had a pistol, as I think, on each side of his waistcoat. I think he took it from within his waistcoat. He said, 'Your life or your money, you buggerer, or I will blow your bloody brains out.' He put the pistol to my throat. I immediately put my hands in my pocket with the intent to take my money out, but instead of giving him the money, I hit him a large blow on his head. I cut at his pistol and then he snapped it at me. I hit him in the belly and then I laid hold of the pistol. A scuffle ensued. He said he was very much hurt and would resign to me. I immediately let him get upon his legs and he ran away directly. I jumped over the bank after him and never lost sight of him till I got hold of him again. He said, 'For God's sake, give me a good licking and let me go.' I got assistance and took him to Bow Street. The pistol is loaded with 6 slugs. Edward Goody is sworn. A young man and I were coming from Chelsea to London. We heard the prosecutor cry out, 'Murder.' We made over the fence and ran to the fields and found the prosecutor and the prisoner struggling together. We secured the prisoner." Israel Johnson deposed to the same effect. The prisoner's defence: "I was coming from Chelsea. I had just done selling my things and I kicked a pistol before me and the prosecutor asked me what I had there. I did not choose to shoot him. I pulled it out to shoot him and then he swore I was going to rob him. If you will please put my trial off until tomorrow morning, I can have gentlemen to my character." William's defence was a bit porous, and it's no surprise that his plea for a character referee went unheeded. This plea may or may not have indicated that it was his first offence. However, it is interesting to note that in modern times a judge calls for character references before passing sentence, but in this case he had no such compunction. A guilty verdict of felonious assault resulted promptly in a sentence of transportation for 7 years. William served some of his sentence on shore in England. Then on the 19th of March 1785, aged 34, he was ordered to be transported to Africa. Early in April 1785, he was received onto the Serres hulk on the Thames. The scheme of transportation to Africa was abandoned in favour of the establishment of a colony of New South Wales. So after nearly 2 years on the hulks, it came about that on the 6th of January 1787, William was delivered to the Alexander to join 192 other male convicts under the command of Duncan Sinclair en route to Botany Bay. The Alexander was known as the dirtiest and most disease-ridden ship of the fleet. The following information is from Ron Withington's excellent research. Ron is a descendant of William and Phoebe. Governor Phillip chose 9 emancipates who were granted land at Prospect Hill. On the 22nd of February 1892, William received a 60-acre grant, 50 acres for being married to Phoebe and an extra 10 for son Charles, who was born on the 6th of September 1789. And he called it Parrish's Farm, again adopting the surname Parrish. William was provided with a hatchet, a tomahawk, 2 hoes, a spade and a shovel. Crosscut saws were available on a share basis. He received grain to plant in the first year and promised 2 sows, which apparently were never delivered. He was obliged to build his own house, but the family was fed and clothed from the government store for 18 months. In December 1791, Watkin Tench visited Prospect and wrote a report. The seaman, William Parrish, at Parrish Farm, had the most land under cultivation. However, overall Tench was pretty unimpressed by the rough dwellings and the state of the crops, while the farmers complained of water shortage and theft by runaway convicts who plundered them incessantly. As a result of the many initial hardships, the total area of land sown at Prospect Hill was only 95 acres by October 1792. On New Year's Day 1792, a second son, William, was born at Rose Hill, that was later known as Parramatta. 8 days later, on the 9th of January, William Sr. was charged in a magistrate's court before David Collins and the Reverend Richard Johnson with behaving insolently and with much abuse to Thomas Arndell, assistant surgeon at Parramatta, with threatening the life of the said Mr. Thomas Arndell, and with insolence and abuse to Mr. Thomas Clark, superintendent, on Sunday the 1st and Tuesday the 3rd of January. Mr. Arndell told the magistrates that the initial incident had taken place in the Parramatta storehouse on the 1st of January, probably while Parrish was collecting his rations. Arndell told Parrish his wife Phoebe should come to Parramatta to have their new baby christened, and Parrish replied that she was very ill. Arndell suggested that he visit her, and if she was ill, he might have to send her to the hospital at Parramatta. Parrish said that she should not come to such a lousy place. On this and other occasions, Parrish became involved in arguments with Arndell about rations that he felt he and his wife were entitled to. A second argument at the Parramatta dispensary also involved Superintendent Thomas Clark, who said he had beaten Parrish with a stick, claiming the former convict had been brandishing an axe, shouting he was a free man and if I ever catch you on my ground at Prospect Hill, I'll kick you off it, while promising to complain to Captain Nepean about being struck by the superintendent. Parrish admitted to the magistrates that he had abused Dr. Arndell, but claimed he had only raised his axe to ward off blows from Clark's stick. When passion gets the better of me, I don't know what I'm doing, he said. Judge Advocate David Collins sentenced him to 100 lashes, there not being any other mode of punishing a person of his description, and of so properly checking that spirit of disobedience and want of subordination which appears in his conduct. William's 7-year sentence had expired a few weeks before this charge. His attempt to assert his new status as a free property holder was met with a harsh response. The case was heard against a background of increasing tension in the colony, with worsening food shortages and malnutrition, following the influx in 1791 of 2,000 convicts from the Third Fleet. On the 22nd of January 1794, a third son, James Norton Parrish, was born at Parramatta. By 1794, Prospect was considered the most fertile of the new settlements. David Collins proudly reported that Prospect Hill proved to be the most productive. Some grounds there returned 30 bushels for one. William, Phoebe and the family pressed on, but in November 1795 they were robbed by 3 runaway convicts who cleaned them out, the servant beaten, goods taken and stock killed. The escapees were caught and hung. Debts seem to have mounted, and in 1798 William is listed as owing Trace £2 14 shillings plus 4 shillings costs, and he was ordered to pay within 14 days. By 1800 William had sold his 60 acres to John Nichols, who became a successful landowner and gardener in the region. The family returned to Sydney. In the 1802 muster, he and Phoebe are still shown as residents in Sydney. William, being a seaman and restless, did return to his earlier vocation for a period, working his way back to England without his family in 1802. He next appears in the company of someone he knew quite well, David Collins, when he travelled from England in company with Collins in 1803 to establish a settlement at Port Phillip Bay. William Parrish, it seems, was recommended by Governor King in a letter to Collins and Lord Hobart, and was asked to supervise the convicts on the sea and land, and fixed his salary at £25 per annum. The Calcutta sailed into Port Phillip Harbour on 9th of October 1803, 2 days after the anxiously waiting Ocean. William had completed a second emigration, this time wielding and not wearing chains. However, Port Phillip was not his destiny. He was to stay there for only 4 uncertain months. He then went on the Lady Nelson from Port Phillip for the Derwent on the 30th of January 1804 with the Free Settlers aboard. The expedition finally reached Frederick Henry Bay on the 11th of February 1804, but the weather again was unfavourable for reaching upriver, and they were forced to wait a further 4 days before joining the Lady Nelson in Risdon Cove. Collins immediately gave instructions to find a more suitable site for his settlement to be named Hobart Town. The surveyor, after only a very short investigation, reported back to Collins that he found a very promising site on a cove across the river. It had a permanent stream and was located at the foot of Table Mountain, renamed later Mount Wellington. Collins declared himself happy with the choice and ordered that the tents, which had already been pitched at Risdon, be removed and erected at Sullivan's Cove on the 20th of February 1804. And so William Parrish participated in his 5th First Fleet settlement in New Holland, Botany Bay, Sydney Cove, Prospect, Port Phillip and now Sullivan's Cove, Hobart. It's doubtful if any individual other than David Collins himself shared this distinction. He also travelled with a young John Pascoe Faulkner, the ultimate founder of Melbourne. William evidently found Hobart Town very much to his liking, and after all he'd spent 17 years with and around David Collins and had travelled from England and Port Phillip with Knotwood, and other men who were the key office holders at Hobart. He had a responsible job, and it was time to collect the family and emigrate from Sydney to Van Diemen's Land. William was on the ocean when it left Hobart, bound for Sydney on the 9th of August 1804. Within 6 months, William returned to Van Diemen's Land and to Hobart to acquire a dwelling, taking Phoebe and his family with him on the Sophia, arriving on the 5th of February 1805. Governor King also sent 26 female convicts with him and appointed William as overseer at Newtown, north of Hobart. Robert Knotwood records in his diary that on the 26th of February 1805 that he went to Newtown where he examined William Parish's farm. William remained in this role at least until December 1805. On the 1st of January 1806, William received a land grant of 70 acres on the eastern shore of the Derwent at the head of what's known now as Geilston Bay. The grant seems to be in return for his services as convict overseer. In October 1806, William is recorded as having his acreage under the cultivation of wheat, barley and gardens, with 1 bull, 3 female sheep, 1 male goat and 2 female goats. William, Phoebe and 1 child, probably James, who was only 12, and a convict, were victualled by the government. On the 14th of July 1807, William is recorded as having 5 acres in wheat, 2 acres in barley, 2 acres fallow and 1/10 of an acre in garden. He had 2 cows, 1 bull calf, 1 cow calf, 5 ewes, 3 ewe lambs and 1 female goat. William, his wife and child were still being victualled by the government. After just 2 years' occupancy on his land, in February 1808, he was once more robbed, this time by the bushrangers Lemon and Brown. They even took his boots. Richard Lemon and his cohorts, Irishmen John Brown and Richard Scanlon, were violent outcasts. Their crimes included the murders of 3 privates from the New South Wales Corps. The settlements of Port Dalrymple and Hobart were by 1808 in full dread of Lemon and Brown. Lieutenant Governor William Patterson in the north offered a bounty of £50 for their capture. Lieutenant Governor David Collins's general orders of 11th of February asked for the population of Hobart to be ready to apprehend the outlaws, to not go into the woods alone, and that no boats except government boats were to cross the Derwent until Lemon and Brown were captured or killed. In March 1810, David Collins died suddenly and William had lost a mentor. In the 1811 muster, Phoebe was shown to be living alone in Hobart while William was most likely elsewhere in the colony. The farming life again proved too much of a trial for the family, and after more than 6 years of ownership, on the 27th of July 1812, William reassigned his 70 acres for an undisclosed sum to Andrew Giles. By the 25th of September 1812, having sold his holding, William was living in a house near Hobart. He was referred to as a settler and living with Phoebe, sons James and Charles Clark, who was a convict labourer. They were robbed by 3 soldiers, Pony, Gorry and Connors, with bushranger James McCabe. At the parish house, 3/4 of a mile from Hobart Town, it was attacked between 9 and 10 o'clock at night. Parish swears to Thomas Connors being one of those who broke into his home, but he cannot swear to the persons of the other 2 soldiers. Mrs. Parish swears to the persons of the 3 robbers having been in the house on the night of the 25th of September and robbing and assaulting her. Connor was the only one of the 3 who struck her. James Parish swears to the person of Joseph Pony as one of the robbers who attacked his father's house. The clothes taken from the parish home were found in the barracks, occupied by Connors and Gorry, by Sergeant Tone. Phoebe lost 3 to 4 pints of blood during the attack. Bushranger McCabe later boasted that he had killed and slaughtered and beat William Parish with an old musket till he bent like an old hind hoop. William in fact sustained chest injuries. Subsequently, McCabe was captured by James Carrott and Thomas Toombs at Oyster Bay, along with associates John Townshend and Peter Geary. In 1813, the 3 robbers were placed on trial in Sydney. Charles Clark appeared as a witness, as did Phoebe, identified 37 stolen muslin and chintz gowns, as well as 13 petticoats and 20 balls of cotton, and McCabe, Townshend and Geary were executed. These events may well have been the trigger for the return of William and Phoebe to living in Sydney, as they were both domiciled there in 1814. William Parrish died on the 11th of February 1817. He was 66. His funeral took place at St Philip's Church, conducted by Reverend William Cowper, and he was buried in the Old Sydney Burial Ground on the 12th of February 1817. This burial ground was closed by Governor Macquarie in February 1820, and the bodies were exhumed in 1869 to make way for the Sydney Town Hall. The bodies were then taken to Town Hall Cemetery and reinterred in Rookwood, then known as Haslam's Creek. Like so many other First Fleeters buried there, neither his grave nor his headstone were ever identified. Phoebe died on the 18th of October 1820, also aged 66. Married as Potter, she was buried as Parrish, the funeral again being conducted by Reverend William Cowper. Phoebe was interned in the new burial ground that had been consecrated on the 27th of January 1820. This was a sandhill cemetery lying south of the brickfields, from which it was separated by a valley, today known as Belmore Park and the Haymarket. It was not her last resting place. By 1901, the cemetery area was needed for the construction of the Central Railway Station. The headstones and the remains of over 2,000 people were moved to another old cemetery on the shores of Botany Bay. This cemetery was dedicated in 1888 as Bunurong Cemetery, but is now known as Botany Cemetery. The inscriptions were weathered away by the salt air, and many of the stones, after falling to the ground, were broken up and scattered. The headstone of John Trace was the only First Fleeter stone to survive. So Phoebe and William's three boys. The oldest, Charles Norton Parrish, was born in 1790. In October 1813, Mr. Charles Norton Parrish, about to leave the colony, requests that all claims be presented for payment forthwith. In 1855, there is a record saying that Charles Parrish was in fact jailed at Parramatta, and he was released on the 30th of December 1855. In July 1856, hawkers and carriers licences. And it mentions that Charles Parrish has a licence in Morven, so he's now in Tasmania, and Charles died as a pauper at Lefroy, Tasmania on the 14th of September 1863, aged 73. Their second son, William Parrish, was born in 1791 at Parramatta. He married Margaret Miller in Hobart on the 3rd of December 1832 when he was 41. Margaret was a convict who had received a 14-year transportation sentence on the 25th of April 1826 under her married name, Margaret Manson. She was recorded as being a married woman from Glasgow, whose husband, John Manson, had left her in October 1825 and went to England. She was convicted of housebreaking and theft by using a false key to enter a baker's home and stealing money over a period of 5 months. She pled guilty. She was recorded as having a child with her and was described as a particularly peaceful woman and well-behaved. She could read but not write and was described as 5 foot 5.5 inches tall with brown hair and dark grey eyes. She was listed as a cook who could also wash, iron and get up linen. She left Scotland on the 16th of December 1826 at the age of 34 on the Sir Charles Forbes to Van Diemen's Land. Margaret arrived on the 3rd of January 1827, and on the 5th of September 1828 she was charged with being at large with her child and sent back to the female factory and confined for 3 months. On the 26th of April 1831 she was assigned to Mrs. Hammond. She was reported to have been absent since April 1830 and cohabiting with William. She had to serve 12 months in crime class. On the 18th of June 1830, she requested permission to marry William Parrish. This must not have been successful, as they applied again on the 25th of May 1831 and then again on the 31st of May 1832, which resulted in success, marrying in December 1832. Margaret received her ticket of leave in 1840 in Hobart, and on the 25th of April of that same year, she gained her certificate of freedom. Margaret died a pauper in the New Norfolk Asylum on the 25th of August 1847 of paralysis at the age of 54, and William died on the 30th of April 1866 in Parramatta. Their third child, James Norton Parrish, was born on the 22nd of January 1794 in Parramatta. He married Mary Ann Redden in Hobart on the 16th of June 1813. He then married Martha Porter in Launceston on the 19th of June 1820, and they had 5 children. He died in Georgetown, Tasmania on the 6th of March 1864, aged 70, and he was a mariner. And there was an article on his death. At Murphy's Hill, East Tamar, after a long and painful illness, Mr. James Norton Parish, a very old colonist. So out of their 3 boys, the only son that had children to pass on the line was James Norton Parish, that had 5 children. Anne Colpitts, the other notable unofficial midwife on the Lady Penryn. Anne was born Anne Wise about 1757 based on her convict record, and her parents are listed in family trees as Robert Wise and Sarah Pape. Anne was jailed as early as 1780. She was described in the indictment files as Anne Watson, a Scottish widow. She'd married Thomas Colpitts on the 7th of January 1778 in Durham, England. There was a series of more than a dozen entries from the Newcastle Courant newspaper between 1780 and 1785, with both Anne and Thomas Colpitts involved in many acts of petty larceny. Together they were part of a long-standing gang described as the Bishop Auckland Gang. The gang was regularly reported as frequenting Gateshead and Gateshead Fell near Newcastle. They were regulars at the local Crown and Cannon Inn. Over about a decade, Anne and Tom Colpitts became quite notorious in the border area of northeastern England. Thomas was jailed on about 5 occasions and Anne on 3 occasions. One of her visits to the prison was for picking a Highlander's pockets. They had at least 3 children over the period of 1779 to 1784. It is likely that the children may have ended up in the workhouses, since both their parents were often behind bars. Apart from petty larceny, Thomas was also convicted for forgery of the British currency. Despite public floggings and regular incarcerations, he remained a serial criminal. Anne was tried at Durham on the 20th of July 1785 for stealing 12 handkerchiefs from a shop with a value of 20 shillings. The indictment: Alexander Gould, Anne Colpitts, the wife of Thomas Colpitts, and Anne Crosby, the wife of John Crosby, for privately and feloniously stealing, taking and carrying away out of the shop of Alderman Thomas Chipchase 1 piece of cotton handkerchief containing 12 handkerchiefs, the value of 20 shillings, the property of Thomas Chipchase at the parish of St Nicholas in the city of Durham on the 9th of February 1785. It's suspected that he has been connected with the said Anne Colpitts and Anne Crosby, and they have practised the privately stealing of goods out of shops in Durham and other places. The said Anne Colpitts is the wife of Thomas Colpitts, late of Tanfield, who was at the last Durham sessions convicted of larceny and sentenced to 3 months' imprisonment in the House of Correction there, and to be twice publicly whipped. Alexander Gould and Anne Crosby were found not guilty. Anne Colpitts was found guilty with the benefit of clergy and was sentenced to transportation for 7 years. She left England with the First Fleet, as we know, on the Lady Penryn. She was listed as 28 years old and her occupation being a servant. However, when she died in 1832, her age was given at 77 years, making her birth year 1755, so 2 years earlier. Anne seems to have been a formidable character who took a broad view of her midwifery duties and was willing to bend the rules to assist women under her care on the voyage out. For instance, Surgeon Bow Smith records that Anne was among the women who engaged in plundering the sailors of necessary cloths and cutting them up for the purpose of their own. They were used to making baby supplies and clothing, and there were none of these on board the ship, so they needed to be inventive. On the voyage, she formed a liaison with John Colthred, a Marine. She bore him a son during the voyage and another in the colony, but both died in their infancy. On the 25th of September 1791, Anne Colpitts married Thomas Smith at St John's, Parramatta. They had 3 daughters, Mary in 1792, Jane in 1795 and Elizabeth in 1797. In the Sydney Gazette on the 13th of October 1810, it says all persons are cautioned against receiving in payment a promissory note for £81 14 shillings, drawn by Thomas Smith, payable to Mary Miller, the said Mary Miller having received payment thereof and given a written discharge for the same. It is highly likely that this is Thomas Smith that married Anne Colpitts, since he had a daughter whose married name was Mary Miller. This suggests that Thomas was still alive at that time. He may have been absent during previous musters while he was away at sea. It seems at some stage that Anne Colpitts and Thomas Smith had gone their separate ways, as we find that Anne has commenced a relationship with Joseph Hatton. Joseph Hatton, a First Fleet convict who in 1792 received from Governor Phillip one of the earliest colonial land grants in what is now Ryde, 2 months before receiving his land grant, Joseph Hatton married a convict, Rose Sparrow, on the 18th of March 1792. Rose arrived in the colony with her mother in 1791. However, in June 1795, she stabbed Joe in the stomach in a fit of jealousy. It is likely that Joseph had formed a liaison with Anne, who was renting the nearby Thomas Jones farm that Hatton eventually purchased by 1802. Hatton requested that his wife not be committed to trial. Perhaps he had a guilty conscience. Anne and Joseph Hatton had a child, Joseph Hatton Jr., who was born on the 5th of May 1800. Anne and Joseph Hatton Sr. developed a farm together at Kissing Point, which is now Ryde, and Anne appears to have continued her work as midwife. 22 settlers, including Joseph Hatton, partly subscribed to the building of the first bark schoolhouse and chapel, one of the earliest in the colonies. In July 1800, the new structure was officially opened, and John and Anne's son, young Joseph, was one of 3 children christened on that momentous day for the settlers of the district. The bark structure was the forerunner of St Anne's Church. By 1802, Joseph had sold his 50 acres to the colonial brewer James Squire and had purchased 30 acres. In December 1804, the Sydney Gazette reported that the family had been robbed of all of its possessions. Tracing through the musters, it's quite difficult as Anne used her numerous surnames, but in 1802 she's recorded as Joseph Hatton's wife and with a child living with him on a 30-acre grant. In 1806, Joseph Hatton states that he has a wife off stores with him on his grant at Kissing Point. The grant's the same 30 acres and is well stocked and cared for. But by 1811, she writes her name as Anne Colpitts. In 1814, Anne Colpitts midwife. In 1825, Anne Hatton widow. And in 1828, there is no mention of Anne in that census. Joseph Hatton died on the 1st of June 1828, having lived half his life in England and the other half in New South Wales. Anne's third daughter, Elizabeth, that was born in 1797, it's a good chance that she was Joseph Hatton's child. She lived with Joseph Hatton until his death in 1828, and in his will in 1823, he left half of his property to Elizabeth and half to Joseph Jr., who was born in 1800. The other Smith girls were not in his will, so that gives a good indication that he in fact knew Elizabeth to be his daughter. Anne Colpitts died 4 years later on the 3rd of August 1832. Her death notice and obituary refers to her as Mrs. Hatton of Kissing Point. This was the name she was known by for many years in the local district. However, she's buried by her legal married name of Anne Smith. She's probably buried in an unmarked grave within the grounds of St Anne's Church in Ryde. After her death, young Joseph took control of the whole 30 acres and laid claim to it. He had probably been working on the grant through Joe Sr.'s later years and before Anne's death. Apparently, young Joseph stated that the original will made by his father in 1823 had gone missing. However, Elizabeth Bryan, née Smith, must have known the contents of his father's will, and she attempted to win back her share. Meanwhile, in 1834, Rose Sparrow, Joe's legal wife, reappeared and lodged a case in the Supreme Court for ownership of all of Joseph Hatton's possessions, including Jones Farm. She based her case on the fact that Joseph Hatton had left no will. By now it became evident that young Joseph needed to find that will. Rose Sparrow would become the owner. Joseph Jr. produced the will, and in March 1837, Elizabeth finally won her case and received from Joseph Jr. her share of the estate, the adjoining 20 acres of Richard Hawkes's farm that Joseph Sr. had previously purchased, and Rose Sparrow received only a small amount of cash. Anne's children, Sarah Colpitts, she was born on the 4th of December 1780 in Durham, England. She was baptised at Cockfield in July 1780. Sarah died on the 28th of July 1841, aged 60, under the name Sarah Dean in Durham. Her grave lists her children, George and Sarah Ann Dean. The second child, George Colpitts, was born in 1782 in Durham, England. The third, Anne and Thomas Colpitts, twins, born in December 1874 in Durham, England. Thomas died in 1794. The fourth, John C. Colpitts, was born on the voyage to Australia in 1787, who was actually a coalthread. The fifth child, William Coalthread, was born and died in 1788 at Sydney Cove. The sixth child, John C. Colpitts, was born on the 1st of January 1789 and died on the 20th of April 1789 in Sydney. The 7th child, also John, born 1790, and he was baptised at St John's, Parramatta, on the 1st of May 1790 and died in 1790. The 8th child, Mary Smith, was born on the 4th of January 1792 at Parramatta. She married Robert Wintington on the 22nd of April 1805 at Parramatta, aged only 13. James Squire was one of the witnesses, but died only 18 months after they married on the 1st of November 1806 at Parramatta. It says, during the night of yesterday, a man of the name of Whittington was shot by a sentinel at Parramatta while endeavouring to cross the river. He had been hailed repeatedly for being fired at, but persevering his resolution to escape met his fate. A coroner's inquest was taken on the body and the verdict was justifiable homicide. The what Whittington was escaping from, not sure. Mary then married John A. Miller in 1810 in Sydney, and they had 2 sons. John died in 1816 in Sydney, aged only 46. Mary owned 30 acres of land at Kissing Point in 1828, and she died in 1882 in Newtown, New South Wales, aged 90. 9th child, Jane Smith, was born on the 18th of July 1795 at Parramatta. She married Spencer Francis of the 102nd Regiment on the 24th of June 1810 when she was only 14 and Spencer 19. Spencer had been born on Norfolk Island in August 1790. He was the son of James Squire and Mary Spencer, a convict. James Squire died in 1822, one of the wealthiest men in the colony, and Spencer was acknowledged in his father's will. James Squire, who was well known for his enterprise and ales, established the first brewery in Australia. Every Anzac Day someone writes into newspapers claiming certain persons to be the first or the youngest enlisted in the armed forces to serve their nation. Possibly the real honour goes to Francis Spencer. In 1792, at the age of 2 years, he was enlisted in the New South Wales Corps as a drummer boy. In line with practices, he was rotated with personnel of the Corps headquarters at Chatham in Kent and then transferred to the 11th Regiment of Foot, Devonshires. His unit served in action against Napoleon's army in Europe. At the age of 17, he returned to New South Wales and was pensioned out. He then operated a bakery for his father, James Squire. In 1821, Francis held 30 acres of land with cattle and crops. And on the 18th of August 1825, where Jane Spencer, late of the Black Horse, Clarence Street, Sydney, did, in the month of December last, separate by mutual consent, and shortly afterwards my said wife departed for Van Diemen's Land, from which place she has lately returned. I now deem it necessary to caution the public, as she may be advised by some person or persons to contract debts, not to credit her on my account, having a family of children to provide for. Jane responded on the 25th of August 1825. Jane Spencer, wife of Francis Spencer, late of the Black Horse, Clarence Street, Sydney, consider it a duty incumbent on me to answer on advertisement published against me in last week's Gazette. I acknowledge that we parted by consent. With my husband's desire that I should leave the colony for Van Diemen's Land, I left the house he was then in possession of. The same morning I went on board the vessel. When I arrived at the Derwent, I obtained a place of service and should have remained there with credit, but my said husband, Francis Spencer, followed me and enticed me from my service under the pretence that he intended to settle at Port Dalrymple. He then persuaded me to return in my service. During this time, he came to this colony to bring the children with him, but finding myself disappointed through his long delay, and I was advised by my mistress, Mrs. Ransom, to return to this colony, hoping that I might find a home, instead of which I found that my former servant, Mary Howe, is now in keeping with my husband and has got the charge of 3 of my children. Beg leave to ask the public at large whether I have been guilty of faults which I am charged with. If anyone can come forward and testify against me, let me die the death of Jane Shaw. Otherwise, let me have the justice due to Jane Spencer. So she's not a happy woman. Francis Spencer received a land grant on the 30th of July 1839. On the 22nd of January 1845, Francis sailed from Sydney to Port Dalrymple in Tasmania, and Jane died on the 23rd of March 1854 at Kissing Point at the age of 58. It says at her residence Clarence Street after a lingering illness, born with Christian fortitude and resignation, Mrs. Jane Spencer, relict of the late Francis Spencer, Esquire, of Launceston, Van Diemen's Land, in her 59th year of her age. The 10th child of Anne Colpitts was Elizabeth Smith, and she was born on the 20th of July 1797 in Sydney. She married Patrick Troy on the 12th of April 1818 at Parramatta. Patrick had been transported on the Providence in 1811, sentenced to 7 years. Patrick purchased 20 acres of land in 1822, and in September 1823, there is an ad: all persons are hereby cautioned for trespassing on my farms at the Field of Mars, known by the names of Stroud and Needham's farms, by cutting down timber or making roads through the same, being determined to prosecute all offenders after this notice. Patrick Troy, Field of Mars. In June 1828, Patrick was jailed for forgery, and the details are: from the evidence adduced, it appears that sometime in the month of July 1827, a man named Patrick McHugh, who resided in Kent Street, Sydney, died. The prisoner Troy, for some time previously to the death of the deceased, resided under the same roof with him, but was separated from the apartments of the deceased by petition. It appeared that they were on terms of intimacy, and that Troy, being aware that the deceased had no relations in the colony, laid claim to the property of which she possessed, forming the design of obtaining that part of McHugh's premises in Kent Street. For this purpose, he applied to several individuals who refused to have any hand in the transaction, but at length meeting with the prisoner Bradley, the writing in question was concerted. It appears that the two prisoners, together with a person named Laurie, who has since escaped, met at the house of the latter about 3 weeks after the death of McHugh, and there in a private room, Bradley drew up the deed, conveying the premises in question to Troy, in consideration, as the deed expressed, of the friendship which the deceased bore him as his countryman, and also of £1, the receipt of which was duly acknowledged on the face of the instrument. The deed was attested by the prisoner Bradley and also by Laurie. A man named Spencer, who was in the house, was also asked to put his name on it, but refused to have anything to do with it, when Troy replied that he was a poor man with a large family and that there was no one to contradict it. Spencer, though, refusing to put his hand to the instrument, preserved silence on what he had seen until after occurrences induced him to come forward and make a disclosure. No mention whatever has been made of the deed of gift in the deceased McHugh's will. The executor, Mr. Edmund Burke, brought an action against Troy, in answer to which he pleaded his deed, but a variety of evidence brought forward convinced the jury that a forgery has been committed, and a verdict accordingly was entered up for the plaintiff, and the prisoners Troy and Bradley were ordered into custody by the judge and the forged instrument directed to be impounded. In the meantime, Spencer has become alarmed at the passive part for which he's taken in the transaction and came forward and related all of the circumstances he had witnessed. The jury, without hesitation, found them both guilty, and Patrick was executed on the 21st of October 1828, and Spencer could quite easily be his brother-in-law. What's interesting with that was that it was 2 years prior where Jane and Frances were airing out their grievances with each other in the paper, and Jane and Frances were quite clearly living separately. So interesting that Frances had a connection still to his brother-in-law, so the husband of his wife's sister, and the fact that he pretty much ratted on them and went back and told every detail in relation to it, which led to his brother-in-law being hung. And it mentioned that Troy was formerly a constable in the Sydney Police, that had left a wife and 5 children. He was always taken at the time to be honest, sober and an industrious man. His conviction of such a crime therefore afforded surprise to those that knew him. Elizabeth then married James O'Brien on the 21st of September 1830 in Sydney, and they had 4 children together. She died on the 7th of July 1877, aged 79. And Anne's 11th child, Joseph Hatton, was born on the 5th of May 1800 at Kissing Point. He married Sarah Patfield on the 22nd of September 1824 in Sydney. They had 10 children, and as mentioned earlier, Joseph took over the running of his father's land, and Joseph died on the 19th of August 1860 at Ryde at the age of 60.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.